Hello, dear listeners. This is the Move Nourished podcast video edition. So this is what we look like when we're talking to you. So welcome to the very first video podcast of the Move Nourished podcast. We are going to take a break from our series on understanding stress. Today we have more episodes for you on that, but we're going to take a little bit of a break and talk about a really cool metaphor that mostly Forrest came up with, but I also helped organize the thinking, I would hope, around understanding digestion and the digestive system. So some of you may have heard of this metaphor of digestive fire, so we're going to start there. But we've fleshed out our thinking as a way of helping you access and understand and organize your thinking around the elements of good foundational digestion, which, as I feel like we don't need to tell you, is crucial to overall health and one of what I'm sure Forrest would agree is like one of the pillars, one of the absolute non-negotiable pillars of good foundational health. So
what bonded us together is like
movement,
nervous system, digestion.
Right. Yep. This trifecta. Yeah, I feel like so much of our work, just as a complete side note, I feel like I work on those three body systems almost exclusively. Like occasionally, right, we'll have someone need something else where it's like they'll need a kidney tea, we'll need to work on the renal system, we'll need to work on skin, we'll need to work on the lymphatic system, of course. But the core of how we work is like supporting and correcting imbalances in the digestive system, the nervous system. Like it really doesn't. Yeah. Like it's pretty much, if you have really good pillars around that, you've done 60% of the work, I feel like.
Yeah.
As an estimate. Yeah. So let's talk about digestive fire, which is a metaphor that some of our listeners may have heard about, but maybe not. Let's assume that they haven't. Digestive fire is a metaphor that herbalists use, and it's not ours, right? It's it's a very old way of and traditional way of understanding and accessing the ideas around digestive vitality and how herbalists work with correcting issues with digestion.
Right.
What is digestive fire?
In Ayurveda, they call it Agni, and in Greek medicine it was called Ignis, both of which just literally mean fire.
Interesting. Those sound like they have a common etymology.
When you think about in those traditional systems, when fire is brought up medically, like the first place the brain goes, we're talking about digestion, because there was this idea of this furnace that is, or I like to think of it as a cauldron that is boiling.
Yeah.
And you're taking your food and throwing it in the cauldron, and you're making a different kind of soup.
Chyme. You're making chyme soup.
You're making chyme soup, which is, it's gross if we think about it too literally.
Don't think about it too hard, dear listener.
Making a soup out of undigested food, but our digestive system is taking what we've already eaten and is processing it into something that we can absorb and use to build our bodies, to use for our body processes. It's really...
And when that doesn't happen, right, we run into all manner of digestive problems, right? So when those fires aren't stoked, it would be like trying to cook food over a fire that's not hot enough to cook the food.
Yes.
And so that's just connecting that to like why this matters.
I think that's where that metaphor historically is, like the boiling cauldron, or I think in Chinese medicine there's pictures that are a little like wooden bamboo steamer for digestion, and the idea is that if you're not having enough of that heat to come up and steam or boil the processes, then you're not going to be digesting that food
and getting everything that you can out of it, or getting it to whatever the shell to crack open so you can actually get at what's inside it. So what are the pillars? There are 3 pillars of digestive fire traditionally, right? So these are the 3 physiological processes that even before we understood them in modern medical language, they were understood as these 3 processes that together, like Captain Planet style, form... Sorry, that was a very millennial joke. They like Captain Planet style form what we understand as digestive fire. So these are the things that you need in order to have that vitality. So what are they, Forrest? I always start with stomach acid.
Yeah. I think that if we're looking at modern ways of thinking about the digestive fire, we have stomach acid, we've got bile, and we've got pancreatic enzymes. And so even in traditional cultures that didn't have those terminologies, they thought about, like, we've always had a thought of, we have protein, we've got fat, we've got carbs. Those food groups existed before their language describing
their medical
them.
language. Yeah.
And there's a sense of there's folks that have weakness in digestive fire for protein or for fat or for carbs, and there's different capacities in the ability to digest those major food groups.
So thinking about like starting with stomach acid, for example, and I think this is a tricky one for folks, and we won't get into this too much here because we don't have time, because that is not the subject of today's episode, but I think there's a lot of misconception around people thinking that they have issues because they have too much stomach acid, and we are frequently having to have the conversation that, like, actually, oftentimes, more often than you maybe think, or you would maybe want to believe, the problem is not enough stomach acid, which can be caused by any manner of things, right? We won't go into the causality of these pieces today, but at some point or another in our adult lives, most of us are going to struggle with digestive vitality at some point, first because of an illness, because of a period of stress, because of an autoimmune, like there's a million different reasons. But at some point, we're all going to struggle. And one of the things that a lot of people struggle with is inadequate stomach acid.
Yeah. And I want to pause for 1 second and rewind, because you brought up a really cool term, is digestive vitality. And I really like that term. It's a term that can almost be a synonym for digestive fire. But in the course of this podcast, we'll look at teasing out maybe some other elements of digestive vitality besides fire.
Besides the idea of fire, So adequate stomach acid, that's one of the biggest pillars. We'll talk in a second about like our favorite herbs to address some of these pieces, but for right now, know that adequate stomach acid is particularly important, right? It's important for all of your micronutrients, or for your macronutrients, but it's particularly important to help you start the process of digesting proteins, right? And it's because within the secretion of stomach acid is also the enzymes that the stomach secretes to help you start breaking down proteins.
Yes.
So stomach acid is very metabolically costly, so it's like there are a lot of ways that can go wrong. What were you about to say?
It's also super crucial for B12 digestion.
Yes.
Absorption
Okay. So adequate stomach acid being the first one.
Super
the second
important.
one, I'm just sort of like traveling through the digestive tract here, would be adequate, robust bile secretion, right?
Yeah.
Bile, dear listener, just like the 5-second version of that is bile is made by your liver, stored and secreted by your gallbladder, and it is the thing that helps you emulsify in order to digest your fats specifically.
Yeah. So you think about trying to wash your hands after you've had grease on them without soap.
Yeah, without soap.
How impossible that is. And then you get a little bit of soap and magically they wash off. That is what bile is doing in our digestive system.
Helps open those molecules up so that you can actually make use of them and break them down further.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor. So again, we'll talk about categories of herbs that are used to address this in a second, but one thing I think just to say in general is that herbs are really good at interfacing with the digestive system, and they can do things that drugs cannot.
Yes.
Which is really cool. So we'll talk about that. So including increasing stomach acid, including increasing bile secretion, and helping to oil those pathways so that you are not only making enough, but you are storing it in a way that is helpful, and then you are secreting it in a way that is most helpful. So adequate. Sorry, I'm a teacher. We're summarizing as we go along here. Adequate stomach acid, adequate bile secretion, and then the third one is adequate secretion and creation and secretion of your pancreatic enzymes. Obviously come through your pancreas.
And a few brush border enzymes too, but our enzymes in general.
Enzymes, enzymatic activity in general, if you will, if you want to say that. So
the enzymes are what actually in the small intestine start to cleave those pieces apart. We have certain enzymes in the stomach that are starting the cleaving under acid, and then most of the magic is happening in the small intestine.
Yes, and so there's an enzyme, at least, there's more, but if you think about them in 3 big chunks, there is an enzyme for each of your macronutrient categories, and the pancreas is responsible for a lot of those, although again some of the protein stuff does happen in the stomach a little bit earlier on in the digestive process.
And so these three things I think represent the workhorses of digestive fire. I think that digestive fire also describes just the process of appetite and the hormonal process of preparing
vigor in that way.
The vigor of the digestive system. It describes the movement of blood into the gut to prepare for these processes. So overall, it's everything that has to come together in the guts and the stomach to then start this process of breaking things down.
Yeah, so that is definitely like, we could talk just about that for an hour. Like we could talk just about these 3 pillars for an hour. What our intention is for this episode and the following episode is to give you a super brief overview and again give you a window into this metaphor that we are using to shape our thinking around as practitioners around like the different ways in which the digestive system can get imbalanced. And so digestive fire is again like 60% of that work is assessing and increasing and supporting digestive fire.
Yes.
Like that's I mean if you do nothing else besides that, you've already done like a grand majority of the work in most cases. But we do also have these other elemental ways of thinking about digestion. So we've talked about fire, we're going to talk about air and what air represents and what earth and water represent.
Right.
And again, these are metaphors to help you access and organize your thinking around the different ways that we can support our digestion and the different elements of good digestion. But again, digestive fire is the biggest one.
And then different way that we can bring plants in. And I think that digestion is this amazing place where like our relationship with plants is evolutionary when it comes to digestion. We are evolutionarily, we sacrificed a lot of hardware in our guts for energy savings that help with things like this. They're very costly.
Our big brains,
And so we outsourced our digestion. And one of the really cool places that happened is in cooking. It just literally...
Sure.
We're one of the...
We just literally made something else heat up our food for us.
We pre-digest our food.
For sure.
In the pot.
There's a really good book, if you're interested, dear listener, on that called Cooked, How Cooking Made Us Human by, I want to say it's Richard Wrangham, but I'll double check. Right. And that is the hypothesis that cooking is what made us human and cooking is what facilitated the leaps forward in evolution that were precipitated by externalizing that high energy cost of digesting like tubers and like just chewing, just like the amount of hours a day like our primate relatives spend chewing.
We can eat tubers like a gorilla, we can eat steak like a lion.
Meat like
we became this like broad spectrum omnivore by saying I don't have the ability to digest that. Let me just come up with a way to help me digest it.
Right, and then the other big one, which we won't get into, is how we basically created a relationship with all of these bacteria that did the rest of the work, but we're not going to get into that right now.
We'll get into that soon.
Later. Yeah.
But plants are the other thing that like, and that's what we're about to get to is like, the plants, a lot of them we can categorize them even by taste, that help this process along, that build our digestive vitality. And these are some of the plants, probably the earliest use of plants.
Yes. So interesting. I think before we get into the plants, because I think there'll be some overlap, we should talk about air, and then we can talk about plants that have, because again, the other cool thing about plants, dear listeners, is that makes them different from drugs is that, and it requires a little bit of a change in your thinking around remedies and medicine, is that a plant is very rarely never just one thing, right? So like, a plant that is good for this is used for this and is really well equipped for this. Yeah, of course, but it's also going to have it's a personality, right? It's just like a person doesn't have just one aspect of their personality. Plants are this what I heard Thomas Easley, my teacher, once call a slurry of constituents, right? And so they're this very deeply complex thing. So there's a lot of overlap, and we can categorize them in order to help our thinking, but that doesn't make them separate, and so we can't use them the same way you use drugs for this one physiological process. Let's talk about air for a couple of minutes and what the element of air represents as it relates to digestion.
Yeah, so I think air is movement, and so we have this digestive tract, and in order for all this great fire process to take place, we've got to move the food from here all the way through. And so air is the process of moving things in a timely manner through the digestive
coordinated
system and churning, keeping moving them like this in all of those places. You can think
I'm doing this because that represents the like muscular contractions, and they're coordinated, and they're this beautiful symphony when they're working optimally.
In the cauldron, it's stirring the pot.
Aha. Yeah. Exactly. So motility might be, gut motility might be
Yeah.
a word that people have heard around that. Peristalsis, migrating motor complex, like those might be words. And so again, if you think about the example of constipation, right? That's an example of that not happening for various reasons. There's obviously
Right.
quite a few reasons that can happen. But overall, the overarching, right, like the end result of that is that stuff is not being pushed out and moved along and swept along in the way that it needs to be in order to like keep
Right.
everything moving. And when that doesn't happen, you also run into lots of problems. So this element of air, we think about like air, thinking about, I don't know, what I think about is like a breeze running through a house when you have the front door and the back door open. And like the breeze is like
Yes.
flushing the fresh air through the house. And that is the metaphor that, or like the visual that comes to my mind.
And like fire needs air to build itself. Like
Yes.
all the fire processes in digestion need air. We think we can.
They don't work as well without.
We can create pancreatic enzymes and in the pancreas and bile in the liver, but we need air. We need movement to be able to squirt them into the digestive. They need to be able to move where they are going to act on the food.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's if you have the resources and you can't get them where they need to go, or the things are not moving through that you can apply them to, then all the resources in the world aren't like necessarily going to help you if they're not.
Yes.
You're not able to get them to the right place, or you're not able to get what needs them to the right place. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So I feel like that's a pretty straightforward way of thinking about it, right? That one is a little bit more intuitive, if you will. It's not quite as complex as the other one. So again, there's some overlap in the herbs that we're going to talk about, some of our favorites, and just a few examples, because the world of digestive is so broad. Like digestive system herbs is like so rich and so broad because of the foundational importance of it. Those are the first herbs that humans probably used.
Right.
And we've been using them for the longest.
But it's really hard. I think air and fire are really hard to separate in the terms of of herbs, because they
because what is fire without, even just like fire, what is fire without air? Fire can't exist without air. So it's like they really, that metaphor really, I think, is elegant here, because they really can exist separately.
Exactly. So shall we talk plants?
Yes. Let's talk about plants. So again, like Forrest was saying, sometimes you can actually know what a plant does by the taste. And so that, I mean, obviously the first entry point here has to be bitters for these plants that are going to increase multiple aspects of these elements of digestive fire. And again, so stay with us, dear listeners, because we are artificially separating this for the sake of understanding it. But again, these plants will oftentimes address more than one aspect of this.
Yes.
Okay. Ginger, not really a bitter, but is an excellent sort of accessible example. Ginger is spicy, which we're going to talk about, right? It's also prokinetic. So like it's going to support air and movement through of movement and muscular contractions, but it's also directly going to stimulate, like stoke digestive fire as well. So don't get hung up on trying to put one of these herbs into these categories. Again, remember that this is a metaphor for thinking about digestion and for thinking about the types of plants that we use to support digestion. So I believe we wanted to start with spicy foods, right? We wanted to start with spicy as that entry point, but I said bitter, so I guess whichever one you want to talk about, you jump the gun there.
Your choice.
Yeah. Well, we've already talked about ginger, so let's talk about spice, because I do think you're right in what you were saying is it's an easily accessible entry point, right? So people think of like spicy food like cayenne, but also things like ginger and all of your warming spices like cinnamon and cardamom, all of that. When we say spice, that's what we mean. We don't just mean like chili peppers.
Right. And those spices, now I think we take them for granted as they're at the grocery store, but they were extremely coveted and traded commodity. And one of the reasons for that is they were the goat for treating digestive system. I mean, you look at Galen and Avicenna and different people in historical medicine, and they have tons of these formulas that a lot of times are called powder to warm the stomach, and it's basically a spice blend. And because that there was an intuitive sense of we call this thing digestive fire. When the digestive fire gets cold, we need these things that when brewed into a liquid and drank give you a warm feeling in your tummy. It's quaint, but it works.
Right, and I think that's the thing about herbalism is like its accessibility does not preclude its usefulness.
Yes.
Right? Like, I think that's a common misconception about just herbalism in general is people that, let me explain what I mean, because let me just not use my like $12 master's level words here. Sorry, we're deep in the end of the semester of first semester of my graduate program, people. I'm so sorry. What I mean by that is just because something is accessible, just because something is readily available and it's sort of like not this, it's not protected knowledge, it's like something, it's like kind of mundane, doesn't mean it's not helpful and effective, and in some cases the most appropriate remedy, because it's going to have a lower propensity for side effects, it's going to be easier for you to access, it's going to be safer, it's going to be, you can use it over a long period of time. There's a lot of reasons for which that's actually a benefit, something being like gentle but powerful.
Yes, and I think that it's also, these spices are things that we pulled in for food preservation. We pulled in making these marinades and things that are making the food more digestible before we even cook it. We have developed this relationship with spices.
Yes.
To the point that it's hard, like you think, oh, that doesn't sound like a very fancy remedy. That's just spices. Right. That's what we cook with. But they are. I mean, I think you mentioned ginger, and ginger is really nice because it's well studied. Ginger, it has studies for increasing the blood flow into the gut. It has studies for increasing gut motility, so it's got that air
prokinetic
too, as a prokinetic. And so we have the beginnings of research on how these things go, and then we have all of the ginger beers and ginger ales and ginger breads and ginger spice,
ginger candies
of history to look like, oh, ginger does something for our tummies.
Yes. So the herbal categorization for that would be like prokinetic, carminative, which basically means that it contains volatile oils that stimulate blood flow to the tissues that they come in contact with. So the tingly feeling on your tongue that you get when you drink something really spicy, ginger or mint or rosemary, those that's volatile oils. That's like those hitting those tissues and bringing stimulation and blood flow to those tissues. And they do the same thing when you intake them in concentrated enough quantities inside your gut.
Yes.
Or your digestive tract.
And one little note I'd say is that I really liked if you look at a lot of spice blends in antiquity, they mix a warm, like potent thing like black pepper,
pungent,
ginger, a pungent herb, and then they mix it usually with a seed from the carrot family. So something like
fennel,
caraway, dill, cumin.
Interesting,
And those were thought, especially in Ayurveda and Unani Tib, to help with that air motility side of things more.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Okay, so those are our spices. And just for the sake of time, I think that's one of our big entry points, right? And that's like very intuitive. So use more spices is your homework. There you go. The second place that I feel like we can't overlook here when we're talking about motility, and you'll hear this, and we've got episodes on this, and you will hear this forever and ever and always for us, is bitters, right? The category of herbs that are bitters. And again, anything that's bitter can technically help digestion, but we're also talking about these herbs that are specifically either well studied or have a long, robust history of use around being used as digestive bitters.
Yes.
And what we mean when we say that is they basically increase digestive fire. They are going to increase the secretion. We know now, right? They increase the secretion of stomach acid. They increase the production and secretion of bile. You told me once, I think I learned this from you, you have bitter receptors on your liver. So even after it gets out of, the bitter flavor gets out of your mouth, think about coffee, right? That's like the most commonly consumed bitter, really, like in the Western world. So think about the bitterness of black coffee, right? Like that, there are receptors for that in your mouth. Obviously, there's 24, 22, 24, something like that. And then there's also receptors on your liver. So it increases the secretion of stomach acid. And in your gut. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And then there's some in weird places that we don't know what they do. Like, I believe there's some in ovarian and testicular.
Kidneys or something.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know what that's about.
Yeah.
I don't think
wonder if that's
there,
like
but
Yeah, I don't think that. Yeah, but okay. Yeah, yeah. Maybe in 20 years we'll know. So incretin, bitter, and we'll give you a couple of examples in a second. But bitters increase secretion of stomach acid, production and secretion of stomach acid, production and secretion of bile, and production and secretion of your pancreatic enzymes. So they're basically stoking
and typically increase motility.
Yeah, and particularly some of them are particularly good at one or other of those things. So again, like any bitter plant will do all of those a little bit, but then there's like a lot of nuance here with yellow dock is like particularly good at the bile part of that equation. It's bitter, so it'll do the other two, but it's known for its ability to produce bile, which is called a cholagogue. So, and then there's ones that are more carminative or more warming. So I would think of Angelica as one that that is both bitter and carminative. So it's going to it's going to have multiple functions, which is why I warned you, dear listener, try not to get caught up at pigeonholing these herbs in one of these categories, because they are complete beings that sort of speak to more than one aspect of this.
And then the fascinating thing with bitters is how they develop this ability. So like bitter taste, typically in nature, plants that are poisonous are more likely to be bitter. There's exceptions, but a lot of
that was why we developed bitter receptors, is to help us detect poison.
Bitter receptors to avoid bitter plants. And most animals with bitter receptors use it for just that purpose. We, however, have the uncanny... So what happens when we eat the bitter receptor is not only do we know in our mind, oh, that's bitter, maybe I should be careful with it, but also our digestive system ramps up fire.
Yes.
That way,
on the off chance...
If we did eat a poisonous plant, our digestive fire is a roaring Yule log that can hopefully burn up and process
that's like that's like your body crossing its fingers. Like,
and so the amazing evolutionary creature that humans are, we'd figured out, you know what? There's some plants that aren't poisonous that still taste bitter, and they still increase my stomach acid. And so when I eat that non-poisonous bitter plant, I have a bigger ability to digest all of that meat that I didn't actually evolve to eat. Like it's kind of like this mouth, like
or like during feast times, like we encountered a surplus, and so we're all trying to gorge ourselves on this surplus because we are like, there's scarcity was the rule, not the exception for most of human history. And so I know that certain plants help me capacitate a temporary surplus of calories that I want to take advantage of as an early human.
Exactly. And we can do that feasting because of our little plant friends.
Yes, exactly.
We can discover agriculture, and our bodies are like, we're not a cow. We actually don't have a lot of digestive capacity for grains. And we're like, but I've got dandelion.
And
then, bam.
Yeah. So, bitters, again, we could talk about that all day, so I'm going to go ahead and cut us off because we could talk about bitters all day, but that's an example. So again, let's close with just a few examples of our favorites, and we've mentioned a few plants, but if we are talking about spices plants, I would say ginger is one of my favorites. I also love dill and fennel, and I love rosemary. Which is resinous and aromatic. I really am drawn to those. So those are some of my favorite spicy plants. But I mean, that includes everything. I mean, we're talking about wasabi, you're talking about horseradish. Like, those are also pungent, spicy foods or spices or spicy foods. Cinnamon. Cardamom.
Coriander.
Yep.
But actually, you bring my mind to, when talking about rosemary, we're talking about like our leafy, herby spices. Another little side of things, which is the nervous system. And so when we think about the volatile oils, it's a carminative, especially like with ginger. But when we get into things like lavender and rosemary and bay leaves and basil, those volatile oils, they're not only stimulating the digestive process, how we already talked about, they also help to increase the parasympathetic tone of the gut, So they're basically helping you go into that digestive
Rest
zone.
and digest.
They're helping your nervous system get ready for digestion, which is really nice.
Yeah, so they're interfacing with more than one body system, and those body systems just happen to be the two, what I would argue, and I will die on this hill, are like the two most important body systems, right? And the two most like comprehensive body systems, the nervous system and the digestive system. Yeah. Which like, I think the more research we find, the more it tells us that are they separate? They're very deeply intertwined. But yeah, absolutely. I would also, just to piggyback off that, I think that there's also a grounding, I don't think, right? There's also like a documented like grounding capacity for bitters. Like bitters have this sort of like very grounding, and whether that's like a vagus nerve thing or whether that's like an energetic thing, like we could argue that. No,
definitely.
But
they have a nervous system
component to them. They kind of like, again, they'll bring you their purpose. So typically when we give them and when we recommend them to clients and we're facilitating their use amongst clients, where they're using them right before meal times, during meal times. And again, everyone at this point has probably encountered this idea that rest and digest, fight or flight, right? That's an oversimplification. We could argue that that's going to be 3 separate episodes on its own. But the idea of like parasympathetic dominant state being optimal for digestion is something I feel pretty comfortable saying. Of that rest and digest state, you need to slow down, you need to feel safe, right? Evolutionarily, right? Like we needed to feel safe enough in our surroundings in order to hold still and be vulnerable, right? Because if you had a bunch of smelly food around you in the wilderness, you had to be in a state where you could, like, that safety was an indicator that you could eat and you could optimally digest your food. So bitters also have that sort of bringing us into a parasympathetic state that allows us to facilitate digestion. Yeah, I would also say, again, Angelica's probably my favorite one. Yeah. I love her. Well, I do.
In the spirit of rest and digest and nervous system, I want to say wood bettoning.
Oh, okay.
It's a bitter, but it's also more often we're thinking of it in the nervous system realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That's how I would think of it primarily. Yeah, but no, that makes sense. And I mean, too, like blue vervain also has that. I mean, that's what I learned to call a shuddering bitter, where it's it's so bitter it makes you go like that, and that is like a little movement release and a little nervous system relaxation. But again, bitterness, but also a very significant nervous system component to that for sure.
Back in the realm of more like rooty traditional bitters.
Strict.
Gentian is my favorite.
Do love gentian. And that one is one that we borrow from TCM, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it exists in both systems and maybe
it does.
in Ayurveda as well. So yeah.
I didn't know that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was a Western herb, a Chinese herb.
Okay.
I don't know if it's a Ayurvedic herb or not, but it could be.
It could be, probably. Yeah. All right. So, dear listeners, before this train like goes off the rails, yes, Forrest, go ahead.
We're missing
y'all. He is always trying to cram in one more thing. Wrangling this man.
Well, we are missing the third flavor.
Oh, right, sour.
Yes. So, sour is the odd child out, I think. We don't talk about sour a ton in herbalism, except for
as it relates to digestion,
its energetics. But we don't think of sours as a thing. We take, obviously all these things used to be foods, but nowadays
they're ubiquitous, so we don't realize that they're medicine.
Yes, and so nowadays we have this sense of, okay, I'm taking ginger or I'm taking my digestive bitters, but when
people take apple cider vinegar,
we take apple cider vinegar or kombucha or our little sour remedies. Usually there's other narratives about what it might or might not be doing, and we don't think about just the simple act of sour being
the fact that it's sour.
And I postulate that sour is probably the first flavor we developed a digestive relationship with, because sour is a less common flavor amongst mammals, and we developed the sour flavor to tell if fruit is ripe enough but not overly ripe, because we want it just right. And so sour was then branded when we started venturing into omnivore eating meats is is this meat gone bad and we don't want to eat it because we don't have the stomach acid level of a lion that can handle a little bit of
that can handle it to be
meat.
Off.
On the other hand, if the meat is completely fresh, we might not have the stomach acid to be able to handle that. It's that just right level of a little bit of age that makes it more digestible.
Yeah, like a dry aged steak, which is coveted.
Yes. And so then fermenting, same thing. Like you ferment it enough that it's more digestible, but not so much that it's going to kill you.
That it's rotten.
And so that's the story of sour. And then we think about all of our fermented foods, our vinegars, our wines, all of
sauerkrauts, our sour beers, our kimchi,
our lime
and
juice and lemons, and the use of that in cooking. Like all of that is the power of sour. And in the digestive
even chocolate is fermented, and like a good chocolate, right? Like a good element of chocolate. If you're not just eating like milk chocolate that's just loaded with sugar, but if you eat dark chocolate, there's a tanginess to it. There's a citrus quality.
So you have good chocolate. You've got a little bit of bitter. You got a little bit of sour.
And chocolate is fermented.
And, and you've got a little bit of it nourishing the depths of your soul, which has to be good for digestion too. But
right.
So in the digestive system, the sour has been used as a tonic historically. It just doesn't get as much limelight. We're really young in knowing how.
Limelight.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It should get the limelight. I mean, lime is sour, but...
Oh, I'm sorry. I was laughing at your pun that I don't think you made intentionally.
So we don't know. There's been postulated the idea that maybe there's actually sour receptors that exist, like bitter receptors that serve a similar function. On the other hand, it's also been postulated that a lot of sour foods are high in histamine, which directly stimulates stomach acid and bile excretion and some of those processes. However it works, sours do seem to have a similar effect of increasing the big three, increasing bile production, stomach acid, and then enzyme production as well. And I think, interestingly, you can see historically some inklings as to which ones work best where. So you'll see lime juice, like a lot of the really acidic sours, like limes and lemons and pineapples, being commonly used more culinarily and medicinally to help with fat digestion. On the other hand, all of the red, like pomegranates, barberries, cranberries, kind of like the tangy red berries, they were used in Unani and Greek medicine and in Chinese medicine specifically for protein digestion. So
there's a lot more nuance around this than we may be conscious of.
So that's all about sours, but they're fun. Don't forget them.
I mean, that's probably not all you know about sours. Let's be real. But that's all I'm going to let you say about sours because for the sake of time.
That's all I can say today about sours. We'll talk later.
Yes, but if you're interested in that, dear listener, be sure to drop us a comment and say, Forrest, please tell us more about sours, because we always like to hear what you guys want to hear from us. So you can reply, leave us a comment, find us on social, and let us know if there's an aspect of this that we would like us to dive deeper into, because as I am constantly reminding Forrest, we don't have an unlimited amount of time on the podcast, and so I can't let him go as deep into it as he would like to, because this man has that, I mean, both of us have a pretty deep well of knowledge, but his is much deeper than mine, and so I'm never letting him dive all the way down to the bottom of his deep well of knowledge, just because I have to keep us on track so that we don't lose you on a 2-hour deep dive into something that you may or may not have time for, dear listener. But let us know what you would like to hear more about. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we are going to be talking about the other two elements of this metaphor for understanding digestion. So we've talked about fire, we've talked about air. Next time we are going to be touching on water and earth, and what elements of robust digestion and a healthy digestive system can metaphorically be represented by those elements. All right. Thank you for listening to the Move Nourished podcast. I'm Alyssa.
And I'm Forrest.
And we will catch you next time.